911. What's your emergency? Please, he's here again. My ex-husband Marcus violated the restraining order, and he's banging on my door. But there's something different in her voice this time, a terror that goes beyond the 3 previous calls she'd made to Phoenix police. 3 months before that final call, Sarah Chen's first report to Phoenix police was almost routine. September 15th, 2025. The audio from that first domestic disturbance call crackles through the dispatch recording. This is Unit 47 responding to a domestic at 2847 Maple Grove Drive. Female caller reports her ex-husband violated a temporary restraining order. But when Detective Lisa Rodriguez pulled up that initial report weeks later, the pattern was already forming. Abuse often begins with non-severe incidents and escalates over time, and Sarah's case was textbook. The first incident, Marcus had shown up drunk at 11 p.m., pounding on the front door and screaming about wanting to see his children. No physical violence that night, just violation of the restraining order and disturbing the peace. Sarah's voice on that September call was steady, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you officers, but he's been drinking again and he won't leave. The kids are scared." The responding officers documented everything properly. Marcus was gone by the time they arrived, but the neighbors confirmed the disturbance. A misdemeanor charge, a fine, another restraining order with stronger language. Detective Rodriguez had seen this exact progression hundreds of times in her 15 years working domestic violence cases. IPV often unfolds in escalating patterns that can persist over time, and the statistics backed up her instincts. Only about 20 to 25% are reported to police, which meant Sarah's willingness to call was actually unusual. Most victims suffer in silence much longer. The second call came 6 weeks later, November 2nd. This time, Sarah's voice carried a different edge. "He broke the window in my car. He was waiting for me when I got off work." The escalation was subtle, but unmistakable. Marcus hadn't touched Sarah, but he'd crossed a new line: property damage, workplace stalking. The responding officers found glass scattered across the employee parking lot at her marketing firm. Security footage showed Marcus throwing a brick through her windshield at 5:47 p.m., then driving away in his pickup truck. Rodriguez reviewed the footage personally that time. Something about the deliberate nature of the act bothered her. Marcus hadn't acted in rage. He'd waited, planned, executed. The brick wasn't random debris from the parking lot. He'd brought it with him. This wasn't loss of control. It was calculated intimidation. By December, the third incident shattered any illusion that Marcus would simply move on. Sarah's voice on the 911 recording from December 18th was barely steady. "He's in my house. I don't know how he got in, but he's been going through my things. My bedroom, my children's rooms. He left a note on my pillow saying he's watching us." The responding officers found evidence of forced entry through a basement window. Marcus had spent hours inside Sarah's home while she was at work and the children were at school. He'd rifled through dresser drawers, moved furniture, left deliberately unsettling signs of his presence. The note on Sarah's pillow was written in red ink: "You can't hide from me. We're still a family." Detective Rodriguez knew the statistics cold. During the first half of 2025, domestic violence was the only crime rate that rose compared to the previous year, with the number of incidents increasing by an average of 3%. But statistics couldn't capture the sick feeling in her stomach as she read Marcus's note. This wasn't just escalation, it was preparation. The kind of methodical psychological warfare that preceded the worst outcomes she'd investigated. 3 police reports in 4 months, each one more invasive, more threatening than the last. Sarah Chen was doing everything right, documenting, reporting, following legal channels. But Detective Rodriguez had worked enough cases to know that sometimes doing everything right wasn't enough to stop what was coming. The system was designed to respond to violence after it happened, not to prevent the escalation that every expert could see building like a storm on the horizon. Between October and January, Marcus had been arrested twice for restraining order violations. Each violation was classified as a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in jail and a $1,000 fine. But Marcus never saw jail time beyond his initial bookings. The first violation in October, the broken windshield, resulted in a plea deal. Marcus paid a $500 fine and received 6 months probation. The second violation in December, the home invasion and psychological intimidation, should have triggered enhanced penalties as a repeat offense. Instead, Marcus's attorney negotiated another plea, anger management classes, and an additional restraining order with stronger language. Detective Rodriguez had seen this pattern countless times. When victims reported restraining order violations, police would listen to the evidence and arrest the violator if they believed the order was violated. But the criminal justice system's response was often inadequate for the escalating danger these violations represented. What made Sarah's case even more troubling was the family court's response. Despite Marcus's documented pattern of violations, the family court judge had maintained his visitation rights with their 2 children, ages 6 and 8. In domestic violence cases, courts may temporarily suspend visitation rights or deny them entirely, but if visitation is allowed, there are often restrictions. But Marcus's visitation hadn't been suspended. Instead, the judge had ordered supervised visits at a neutral location, visits that Marcus had been skipping since November. His failure to appear for court-mandated supervised visitation wasn't treated as contempt of court. It wasn't even documented as another violation of the custody arrangement. The system simply allowed him to ignore the court's orders without consequence. Sarah's voice on a recorded call to Detective Rodriguez from January 15th captured her growing desperation. He's not showing up for the visits with the kids, but somehow he still has rights to see them? And when I ask the family court what happens if he violates the restraining order again, they tell me that's a criminal matter, not family court. But the criminal court just keeps giving him plea deals. The disconnect between family court and criminal court was creating a dangerous gap in protection. If a parent has been convicted of domestic violence or committed abuse in the last 5 years, the abusive parent may still visit the child, but usually with limits or supervision. But Marcus hadn't been convicted of domestic violence. His violations were being pleaded down to lesser charges that didn't trigger the family court's enhanced protections. Detective Rodriguez understood the legal constraints she was working within. When victims contacted police to report restraining order violations, police would listen to the victim and look at evidence, but enforcement was limited to immediate violations. She couldn't arrest Marcus for future threats or escalating patterns, only for specific acts that had already occurred. By February 2026, Sarah had filed 4 police reports in 5 months. Marcus had been arrested twice, convicted of nothing serious, and was still legally entitled to visitation with their children. The restraining order had been violated repeatedly, but each violation was treated as an isolated incident rather than part of an escalating campaign of terror. Detective Rodriguez knew what the data confirmed. Patterns of repeated violations of prior orders of protection posed documented danger to victims, their families, and household members. But knowing the pattern and having legal tools to stop it before violence occurred were 2 different things. The system was designed to respond to violence after it happened, not to prevent the methodical psychological warfare that every expert could see building towards something much worse. Sarah Chen was doing everything right, but the legal system's fragmented response was failing to protect her from what Detective Rodriguez feared was coming next. Looking at Sarah Chen's case, 3 restraining order violations in 4 months, each one more calculated and threatening than the last. Do you think the legal system should have treated Marcus's escalating pattern as one continuous crime instead of 3 separate misdemeanors? Comment your answer below. Now, let's see what happened when Detective Rodriguez tried to predict what Marcus would do next. By January 2026, Marcus Chen's world was collapsing around him. 3 weeks after his 3rd arrest for violating Sarah's restraining order, his construction company fired him. The official reason was attendance issues, but everyone on the crew knew the real story. Marcus had been showing up late, reeking of alcohol, picking fights with co-workers over minor disputes. Marcus's drinking had accelerated dramatically since December. What started as a few beers after work had become a bottle of whiskey before noon most days. The alcohol didn't calm him. It sharpened his obsession with Sarah. The audio from a 911 call on January 28th captured the effect of this toxic combination. Sarah's voice trembled as she reported to dispatch. "He's been sitting in his truck outside my office building for 3 hours. My coworkers are scared to leave. He keeps revving the engine and staring at the windows. When police arrived, they found Marcus passed out behind the wheel, an empty vodka bottle on the passenger seat. The arrest report noted his blood alcohol content at 0.18, more than twice the legal limit. But even more disturbing were the items officers discovered in his truck: a detailed schedule of Sarah's daily routine, printed Google Maps directions to her children's elementary school, and a notebook filled with increasingly violent fantasies written in Marcus's handwriting. Detective Rodriguez reviewed the evidence with growing alarm. Marcus had now lost his job, was drinking heavily, and was displaying the methodical planning behavior that preceded the most dangerous domestic violence escalations she'd investigated in her 15 years on the force. The notebook entries were particularly chilling. One passage, dated January 15th, read, "She thinks she can hide from me forever. She thinks those cops can protect her. She's wrong about everything. I know where she goes when she goes there, who she talks to. I know everything." But the most troubling discovery was a receipt found in Marcus's wallet for a hunting knife purchased at a sporting goods store on January 20th, 8 days before his arrest. When officers asked about the knife during booking, Marcus claimed he'd lost it. A search of his apartment and truck turned up no knife. Sarah's employer had implemented additional security measures after the parking lot incident, including escorting employees to their cars and installing panic buttons at reception desks. But these workplace protections only covered 8 hours of Sarah's day. She had been forced to tell her supervisor about the situation, but she lived in constant fear that Marcus's escalating behavior would cost her the job she desperately needed. The psychological warfare was working exactly as Marcus intended. On February 10th, just days before the end, Sarah made her final call to Detective Rodriguez. Her voice was no longer trembling, it was hollow with certainty. "I know you're doing everything you can within the law, but I need you to understand. He's not going to stop. The restraining orders, the arrests, the court dates, none of it matters to him anymore. He's planning something. I can feel it. Please, I'm begging you. There has to be something else you can do." Detective Rodriguez had worked enough domestic violence cases to recognize the warning signs of imminent lethal violence. The combination of job loss, substance abuse, stalking behavior, and acquisition of weapons created a perfect storm. But her hands remained tied by a legal system designed to respond to crimes after they occurred, not to prevent the methodical escalation that every expert could see building toward a tragic conclusion. Marcus Chen was no longer just violating restraining orders. He was preparing for something much worse, and everyone involved knew it, except the legal system that might have been able to stop him. February 13th, 2026, 7:47 a.m. 8-year-old Emma Chen's voice cut through the emergency dispatch recording. "My mommy won't wake up. There's blood everywhere, and she's not moving." The 911 operator's training kicked in immediately. "Okay, sweetheart, I need you to be very brave for me. Are you safe right now? Is the person who hurt your mommy still there?" "No, he's gone. My little brother is hiding in the closet. Please send someone. Mommy's eyes are open, but she won't talk to me." The Chin Children's 911 call represented the outcome Detective Rodriguez had been dreading for months. The audio recording would later become evidence in a murder trial, but in that moment, it was simply two terrified children discovering their mother's lifeless body in their suburban Phoenix home. The responding officers arrived at 2847 Maple Grove Drive at 7:52 a.m. to find Sarah Chen dead on her kitchen floor. She had been stabbed 17 times with what the coroner would later identify as a hunting knife. The same hunting knife Marcus had purchased on January 20th and claimed to have lost during his arrest 8 days before the murder. Detective Rodriguez was called to the scene at 8:15 a.m. The moment she stepped into the blood-soaked kitchen, the sick feeling she'd carried for months crystallized into rage. Every escalation, every violation, every plea deal that had kept Marcus on the streets instead of behind bars had led to this exact moment. The children were found exactly where Emma had described: 6-year-old David hiding in his bedroom closet, still wearing his Superman pajamas, too traumatized to speak. Emma had stayed on the phone with 911 for 14 minutes, following the operator's instructions to keep her brother calm while emergency responders raced to their home. Marcus's pickup truck was spotted by patrol units less than 2 miles away at 8:31 a.m. He was sitting in the parking lot of a convenience store, the bloody hunting knife visible on the passenger seat. When officers approached with weapons drawn, Marcus didn't resist. The arrest report noted that he appeared calm, almost relieved. "I told her she couldn't hide from me forever," Marcus said to the arresting officer, his words captured on body camera footage. "We were supposed to be a family. She made me do this." The crime scene told the story of Sarah's final moments with devastating clarity. She had been making breakfast for her children when Marcus forced his way through the same basement window he'd used during his December break-in. The struggle had been brief but violent. Defensive wounds on Sarah's hands showed she had fought desperately to survive. What haunted Detective Rodriguez most was the timing. Sarah's murder had occurred just 18 hours before a scheduled family court hearing where she planned to request supervised visitation be suspended entirely due to Marcus's escalating violations. The legal system had been one day away from potentially providing the enhanced protection that might have saved her life. The psychological trauma of finding their mother's body would require years of specialized therapy for Emma and David, another hidden cost of the system's failure to stop Marcus's methodical escalation. By 9:15 a.m., the crime scene was secured, Marcus was in custody, and 2 children had lost their mother to the violence that every expert had seen coming. Detective Rodriguez stood in Sarah's kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a murder that felt entirely preventable, knowing that the legal system's fragmented response had failed at every critical juncture. The restraining orders, the arrests, the plea deals, the family court proceedings, none of it had been enough to protect Sarah Chen from the man who had spent months methodically planning her death. 6 months after Sarah Chen's murder, Marcus Chen stood before Judge Patricia Martinez in Maricopa County Superior Court for sentencing. The charge of first-degree murder carried a punishment of life imprisonment or the death penalty, but the prosecution had agreed to a plea deal that reduced the charge to second-degree murder with a presumptive sentence of 16 years imprisonment. Detective Rodriguez sat in the gallery, watching as the man she'd been tracking for months finally faced consequences for his methodical campaign of terror. Marcus had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for the prosecution dropping additional charges of stalking, burglary, and multiple restraining order violations. The plea agreement meant he would serve 25 years to life in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under Arizona law for his conviction. The victim impact statements painted a devastating picture of the lives Marcus had destroyed. Sarah's sister spoke about Emma and David, now living with her family, still requiring specialized trauma therapy to process finding their mother's body. Emma, now 9, had developed severe anxiety and couldn't sleep alone. David, 7, had stopped speaking for 3 months after the murder. But it was Detective Rodriguez's testimony to the court that revealed the true scope of the system's failure. "Your Honor, I want the record to reflect that Sarah Chen did everything our legal system asked of her," Rodriguez said, her voice steady but strained. She filed police reports, obtained restraining orders, documented every violation, cooperated with our investigations. The system failed her, not the other way around. Rodriguez detailed how Marcus's escalating pattern had been treated as isolated incidents rather than a coordinated campaign of terror. Each restraining order violation had been plea bargained down to lesser charges. The family court had maintained his visitation rights despite his documented pattern of violations. The criminal court had no mechanism to address the cumulative danger his behavior represented. Judge Martinez listened to Rodriguez's testimony with visible frustration. "Detective Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, could this murder have been prevented if the system had responded differently to Mr. Chen's pattern of violations?" "Yes, Your Honor. Absolutely. If Marcus Chen had served meaningful jail time after his second violation, if his visitation rights had been suspended after his home invasion, if the courts had treated his escalating pattern as the serious threat it represented, Sarah Chen would likely be alive today." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Martinez delivered Marcus's sentence, 25 years to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. In Arizona, first-degree murder carries a punishment of life imprisonment or the death penalty, but even the reduced charge ensured Marcus would likely die in prison. Following Sarah's case, Phoenix City staff reviewed updates to how the city handles domestic violence incidents based on recommendations from the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team. The changes implemented in early 2026 included mandatory risk assessments for all domestic violence calls, enhanced coordination between criminal and family courts, and a new protocol requiring detectives to personally contact victims within 48 hours of any restraining order violation. Detective Rodriguez was promoted to supervisor of the Domestic Violence Unit, where she now trains officers to recognize escalation patterns and advocates for legislative changes that would allow courts to consider cumulative violations as aggravating factors in sentencing. The Phoenix Police Department achieved National Incident-Based Reporting System certification in January 2026, enabling better understanding of every incident to develop more effective strategies for addressing criminal activity. But for Emma and David Chen, now growing up without their mother, these systemic changes came too late. Sarah's case had become a textbook example of how domestic violence escalates when legal systems fail to recognize the deadly progression from psychological warfare to murder. The restraining orders, the arrests, the plea deals, none of it had been enough to protect Sarah from the man who spent months methodically planning her death. Marcus Chen's conviction closed the case, but it couldn't close the wound his violence had torn through 2 children's lives, or erase the knowledge that Sarah Chen's murder was entirely preventable if the system had been designed to stop escalating domestic violence before it turned lethal. Subscribe for more investigations that expose system failures, and watch this deep dive into police response protocols next.